I'd like to turn over to start off with our final session where we're looking at advanced groundwater science. And obviously we always talk about ASR and brackish desal. And then finally we're going to talk about 3D modeling and visualization as well as a part of that component. So to start that off, we have two wonderful presentations, and I'd like to start by introducing Dr. Gretchen Miller, who is with the Texas A&M University. Let's welcome Dr. Gretchen.
Howdy. We start every class at A&M like that. Well, most classes at A&M like that. It gets our students paying attention, so I've got your attention now. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to give a talk on ASR today. I am a professor in civil engineering, and I'm also affiliated with the Water Management and Hydrologic Sciences program. This is a joint effort between the Department of Civil Engineering and the Texas Engineering Experiment Station, as well as my collaborator, who I'd like to acknowledge, Yuping Shang, in the Bio and Agricultural Engineering Group, and also a researcher at AgriLife in El Paso. So what is the research initiative? Well, the purpose of it was to provide the foundation to expand Texas A&M's research capabilities and service to the state in the area of aquifer storage and recovery. Our funding came from a state legislative appropriation for water conservation technology that has happened over the past 3 sessions. So we've been funded from fiscal year 14 to fiscal year 16. Or through this fiscal year, so fiscal year 17. Personnel includes myself and Dr. Shang, and we have a number of graduate students, particularly Ben Smith, who will be looking for a job shortly, and Sahili Majumdar, who have been working with some of the modeling I'll be showing you. We've also had past contributors at TAMU Corpus Christi and TAMU San Antonio. So just a brief introduction to ASR and its more umbrella term, managed aquifer recharge. I wanted to bring this up just to give you a bit of background. So when we talk about managed aquifer recharge, we're talking about any kind of technology that we use to enhance either natural infiltration or natural recharge into an aquifer. Due to the configuration of a lot of our aquifers here in Texas, we have rather thin recharge zones, and so some of the waters that we have are rather old because of the travel times it takes to get to those recharge zones. So aquifer storage and recovery is a good option in a lot of areas where recharge doesn't happen naturally. I want to talk about some of the differences between our different managed aquifer recharge techniques. The two primary ones I think that are the most important to note are infiltration basins. So these are designed to pump water into the subsurface, but passively, so not pumping, but allowing it to flow on its own. And aquifer storage and recovery, which is the idea of pumping water into a well and then being able to pump water back out of that well. We have some other concepts I want to discuss. Dry wells, which are similar to infiltration basins, except that they are bored into the ground and then flow passively. Bank filtration, which is the idea of allowing extra water to flow into the subsurface or into superficial aquifers. And then aquifer storage, transfer, and recovery, which I just want to mention is different from ASR in that we have storage occurring in one well and recovery occurring in a down gradient well. Versus ASR, which is traditionally classified as storage and recovery in the same well. Okay, so what are the advantages for managed aquifer recharge? They're pretty apparent here in Texas over, say, a traditional reservoir, which we would use as a buffering capacity against drought and for times of high flow. Reservoirs suffer from several different things, primarily evaporation from the surface, so water loss in that storage, land consumption, which we all know be massive, and implementation, which can take decades. Their one bonus that ASR and infiltration does not have is that they have high recreational values. You can't really go boating in an ASR well unless you're really tiny. So ASR, however, skirts some of those issues that make reservoirs particularly problematic. Land consumption is fairly minimal. Ecological impact is minimal, really limited to energy use, and implementation can be done on a much more rapid scale. The same goes for infiltration basins, which do occasionally have positive ecological impacts, particularly ones that become wildlife refuges. Okay, so why isn't Texas doing more managed aquifer recharge? You can see on the map we only have, and depending on how you count, we have 3 to 4 locations where this is being done. El Paso and Saws, the Twin Oak facility, are the two big ones, and Kerrville, and as well as an area in the Edwards Aquifer that I haven't gotten much details about, but that's doing a artificial recharge project as well. So we don't have very many of these facilities, and some of the biggest concerns when the Water Development Board asked users why not was that physically recovering stored water, I think, was the biggest barrier. That said, this was done in 2011 before some of the recent legislative actions, which have changed how that water is accounted for and who owns the water pumped in during ASR. So I think this physical recovery, somebody not stealing my water, has really gone down as a concern. At this point, we're looking at maybe issues of quality of recovered water, and lack of data on aquifers, lack of support, and just generally lack of knowledge. And so when we looked at all of these issues at A&M and decided what we wanted to research, we came up with 4 areas where we thought we could contribute. And I'd like to discuss each of these a little further to give you an idea for what kind of research that we're doing and where we might be able to help, say, an individual municipality or groundwater conservation district that wants to implement some of these techniques. Okay, so Project 1, the first thing we wanted to tackle was just taking a broad look around the state at where ASR might be feasible. And when we said feasibility, we thought of a range of different potential factors. We went around and around, arguing what we really wanted to look at here. And as hydrogeologists, as engineers, we decided to confine ourselves to saying, okay, where is the hydrology most appropriate? And in order to do this, we essentially took existing data from a wide array of sources. I think the data compilation part of this took us the longest of any of it. And we constructed a GIS database here and then came up with an algorithm to analyze which areas would be better for ASR than others. So some of the factors that we look at here are transmissivity, the idea that we want an aquifer to be transmissive enough that we can readily pump down the amount of water that we want to place in the aquifer, but we don't want it to be so transmissive as that it's gone by the time we want to pump it back. The same goes for hydraulic gradient. Areas where hydraulic gradients are high are generally not as conductive to ASR, and I'll show you why in a little bit later. We wanted an area where well density was low. So that's for this idea of we don't want to be interfering with other wells, and we don't want other wells interfering with ours when we're doing ASR. And then depth to aquifer and depth to groundwater, which gave us indications of hydraulic head in the existing aquifer and storage capacity, as well as technical difficulty or technical possibilities associated with actual well drilling, as well as costs associated with well drilling, which we all know gets charged by the foot. Okay, so our findings on this project is we looked at two aquifers in particular, and I have to say we chose these because they were a little close to home. So we looked at the Carrizo-Wilcox and the Gulf Coast Aquifer System. All the areas in green, so the darker green, the more favorable for ASR. The lighter colors, reds and neutrals, are less favorable. And you'll see that we have a lot of areas in this aquifer that can be particularly favorable, particularly around through the central part of the Gulf Coast, so not too close to the Gulf, a little ways in. You'll also see some bullseyes here, if you look really close in the green, and these develop because there's regions where we have high hydraulic gradients due to pumping. So what you're seeing is the bullseye around existing pumping, our existing drawdowns. You'll also see we have areas where we have low feasibilities, and in some of these areas, it's not so much that we don't think ASR is feasible, it's that we don't have enough information. Right, so this is where there were insufficient monitoring wells that we could get access to, at least. So this is kind of intended to be let's look at what municipalities, what towns might benefit the most. For this group, we probably should have classified these by districts, by GCDs. I think that probably would have been more useful for you. But we could certainly do that sort of analysis. This one is really intended as a demonstration at a large scale. We would love to be able to do this on a smaller scale using the same sort of algorithm, but maybe with not state scale data, but more local data. And I think we could probably give a more particular result so that you can look at, okay, in my conservation district, where do I want to do maybe a pilot study on this? Or where do I want to look further into doing this? Our second project addressed MultiWell ASR, which we found in the scientific literature was not covered very extensively. So in these multi-well ASR systems, we have a number of wells in close proximity that are used for storage and extraction. And we had a couple questions about these. How do those wells interact? And given that we have a big well field, how can we operate that well field as a system as opposed to operating it as individual wells? So how can we enhance what we call recovery efficiency? So how can we enhance the percentage of water that we've put down that we can recover? And then how can we enhance energy efficiency? So if we're extracting groundwater, obviously that takes energy to produce. So how can we use this system configuration to our advantage? And so, of course, we did a case study. We created a mod flow model of the Twin Oaks facility so that we could, and it has a new name now, but we knew it first as Twin Oaks. So this is the facility in San Antonio at the southern tip of Bexar County. And we wanted to know how all of their 28 to 35 wells, depending on how you count or depending on what's operating when, act together. We found that we were able to do the modeling, except for the fact that all of these wells acting together created, and in such close proximity, created some really complex hydraulics. And made it somewhat difficult computationally to figure this out. So it took us a while to get the right solvers, get the right model together to be able to model the hydraulics well. But you can see we match, this is the SCADA data from the system. We match it fairly well with some obvious deviations when the SCADA, which we knew was not entirely QA/QC'd by the time we got it, when the SCADA system was probably having difficulties. And so you can see we get a fairly good, I think, for the number of points we have, observed versus modeled values. So our main finding was this, for this study, and the main thing we wanted to know is when all of these wells are acting together, or when all of these wells are acting as storage, how do they interact? For each well, do we have a coalescing of water in the subsurface between wells, or do we have the bubble that we talk about in ASR of stored water around each well? And we found out, of course, that the classic academic answer, it depends. You can see for our model in 2014, so this is a realistic model after they've been pumping in and out of the aquifer for over 10 years, that we're starting to get coalescing between these bubbles. So each of these, the darker the blue, the higher the fraction of injected water at that particular location. Okay, so dark blue is all of the water in the aquifer at that location is injected water, and then white is none of the water is injected water. Now, what we really wanted to know is how, in the long run, recoverable this water was going to be, because a lot of times when you hear about ASR systems, and this is I don't want to hear anybody ever say this again, that, we can recover 100% of the water we put down, okay? In quantity, that might be true, but on a molecule-by-molecule basis, you can never do that, because injecting it is actually a reversible process, or an irreversible process. And we show that in this 2023 plot. What we did in our model was to reverse what we had done. I'm checking on the time. Reverse what we had done before, and you can see there's still injected water in the aquifer despite the fact that we've removed quite a bit of it. Going through some of the other projects, we're looking at MultiWell ASR system operations. So using what we call a Sandbox Model to tell us, okay, how do we make decisions about where we pump and when? And we show that that the way we make decisions is really affected by our aquifer parameters. So for instance, hydraulic conductivity and hydraulic gradient. Both of these, the higher they are, they decrease recovery efficiency and energy efficiency past a certain point. So like I said, with transmissivity, there was a sweet spot for that. And then finally, we're looking at infiltration basin modeling. So what short-term and long-term rates can be expected from these basins. So looking at the El Paso plant, we have a suite of monitoring equipment out there to get a good handle on how fast water is recharging into the basin. We found that an average infiltration rate between 6 and 32 feet per day, which was much higher than we expected, but that this really depended on how clogged the aquifer was and the presence or absence of recharge rates. So if we could do the video real quick. Let's see, I guess that's on your left, let's start that video again. You can see the darker colors are the more saturated, so red is totally saturated. You can see the recharge moving down fairly quickly to the aquifer. On the right, though, we have perched clay layers, and you can see how the perched clay layers influence, we get a buildup of saturated water until there's enough to push it through the clay layer. And so studies like these let us know what our capacity is and give us a way to model these sorts of scenarios in, say, other locations. With that, I think I am nearly out of time, or over time. So just a few things I wanted to mention as takeaways. ASR and related technologies are really underused in Texas, and many areas do provide favorable geology for recharge. The bubble concept that we hear a lot about can be kind of misleading. You can never get 100% of your water back, but you can get 100% of high quality water back. Then just the modeling that we're doing can really provide some insight for both pre-planning of ASR facilities and operations. In the future, we're going to be looking at really creating some operational principles and some tools that MultiWell ASR facilities can use when they're doing decision making, as well as taking our existing models and looking at the associated water quality issues with the ASR systems. And with that, I'll give you my contact information, and thank you for your attention.